Up next is Ville. He works at Expo. He works on Expo CLI primarily. So he's going to talk about what's new in Expo CLI. And it looks like we're already ready, so I'll just let him go ahead.
Hey, I'm Ville. I'm going to talk about a few reasons why those of you who are using Expo CLI have seen these annoying notifications about new releases of Expo CLI recently, and also about a couple of features that are coming to Expo CLI very soon. But first, it's a bit of history of Expo CLI and how I ended up working on it. Back in 2016, when my very hot GraphQL startup had just failed, I went back to building apps with React for various startups. And when I was creating these apps, around the same time, a new project named Create React App was released. And I found it really useful. And I found a configuration-free approach. It took groundbreaking. So I ended up using it, and soon I also ended up contributing to it. So I sent some pull requests, and soon I was one of the maintainers of Create React App. I also opened some issues for things that I wished it had. This particular one was about enhancing the support for React Native for web. That particular issue, unfortunately, didn't really go anywhere, and I sort of forgot about it for a few years, and mostly focused on building apps for iOS and Android. So there I was doing consulting and building these apps, but what I really wanted to do was to make open source. So fast forward about a year, I joined Expo and started working full-time on open source. And Expo had, just before that, recently released this project named Create React Native App, which was somewhat inspired by Create React App. So it's no surprise that I also ended up working on that a bit. And Expo also had a couple of other tools for building apps using Expo. Exp, the command line tool, an XDE, an Electron app for the desktop. So I also contributed a bit to those. And then last year, we were looking at all these tools and found out that it's a bit confusing to people who are starting to use Expo, that there are 3 different tools that essentially do the same thing, but are just slightly different, and each have their strengths and weaknesses. So we decided to put all of these 3 tools, Create React Native App, Exp, and XDE together. We took the best parts of Create React Native App and Exp CLIs and added also a graphical user interface in the browser. And so Expo CLI was born around a year ago. And now I'm mostly working full-time on Expo CLI. So the first new thing that I want to mention is the web support Evan talked about earlier today. And if you remember that GitHub issue from the last slide, you can already guess that I was pretty excited to be helping him add this to the Expo CLI, because that makes it possible to build iOS, Android, and web apps using Expo CLI So it essentially makes it the tool that I was dreaming of a few years ago when I made that GitHub issue. And web support in Expo CLI starts when you just enable it in your app.json and start the dev server like you do with any Expo project. With Expo Start, it runs Webpack dev server, which builds the JavaScript for web. And we still use Metro to build the JavaScript for iOS and Android. And we also have this new command, Expo build web, which takes your Expo app and bundles all the JavaScript together and outputs a PWA, progressive web app that you can just deploy to a web server and have a web app built with Expo. So I'm really excited about Expo for web. The next thing that we recently released is Unimodules. Expo SDK used to be this huge monolithic package that had a lot of useful APIs in one. But we've recently split it up into modular packages that you can mix and match and just use the ones that you need. And you can also use them in any React Native app, as was mentioned before. And that's called the Bear workflow. To support the Bear workflow, the thing that we added in Expo CLI is the bare minimum template. So now when you run Expo init, you can choose if you want a managed app, which is like the previous default workflow using all the Expo APIs in Expo client. And then you can also choose the Bear workflow, which gives you an app that's not unlike the one that you get from React Native init. So it uses the same template with only the minimal configuration for using Unimodules added to it. And then you can install any Unimodules that you want. And you can use them like this in Bear apps. But in managed apps, even though the Expo SDK is now powered by these individual modular packages, in managed apps, you still import them from the Expo package. But this is less than ideal for a couple of reasons. First, it makes it harder to detect which code is actually being used in the app, so it makes it harder to tree-shake the JavaScript and remove unused code when making a bundle. And it also makes it more difficult to detect which native modules are actually used in the app and make native builds that only include those native modules that are used. We also need to document both of the ways in each of the Unimodule, which makes it a bit harder to learn how to use them. So therefore, in the next SDK version, we'll be changing the syntax to import Unimodules in managed apps to match that of the Bear apps. And there's just one gotcha. In managed apps, you need to use the same version that's included in that SDK version, because that's what gets built into Expo CLI. And the SDK has a lot of these modules included. Here's just one part of the list. So you need the correct version. So to make it easier to install those, packages, we are adding a new command in Expo CLI, Expo install. And you can use it just like npm or yarn and install packages. And if the package you're installing is a unimodule, what it does, it looks up the correct version from the Expo SDK that you're using and calls npm with that version. Or if the project you have is using yarn, it can also use yarn to install the packages. The last thing I want to mention is the ad hoc client builds Quinn gave a talk about earlier, which make it possible to build and distribute a custom version of the Expo client that's used to develop managed Expo apps. And this is really cool because it makes the development environment more similar to the actual app that you'll be distributing to the app stores, because it will have the same native configuration. And this, in turn, makes it possible to use also APIs that were previously not available in Expo Client, like payments, which require that custom app-specific configuration to be there. So in Expo Client, you can use this feature as soon as it ships, which should be really soon, using the Expo Client iOS command, and it will guide you through the whole workflow and create the certificates, provisioning profiles, register the devices, and distribute your app to them. So that's all I have today. Thank you.